So I guess we should start. So hello, everyone. I'm Ash Alam. I'm a senior lecturer in social planning and one of the co-directors of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at Melbourne Architecture, Building and Planning. And on behalf of InfUr, I invite you all to our seminar with Dr. Ohoud Kamal. So before we start, we acknowledge that this event takes place on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We respect elders past, present, and emerging, and we also recognize the value of indigenous knowledge in the academy. So before Ohoud starts, I think Ohoud needs a good introduction, and because Ohoud has been a long friend of InfUr, so she has been following InfUr since its inception. So Ohoud received her PhD from Newcastle University in the United Kingdom in 2020. She was working with Professor Ali Madanipur, perhaps you know the name. Her PhD was titled Temporary Space in Amman, a co-creation of everyday activism and state flexibility. And Ohoud is currently assistant professor at the American University of Madaba in Jordan. Her research is mostly focused on ad hoc and temporary urban environments. She also does a bit of practice-facing research, and she is also involved in practice. At the moment, she's part of a design team in Jordan, in Amman, developing an experimental community park in Amman. And obviously, I mean, Ohoud is a person of many talents. In her spare time, she composes music, and she has a really well-curated website. So www.ohoudkamal.com. So you can actually listen to some of those compositions over there. And the other thing that's very exciting and interesting, so Ohoud co-founded Southern Urbanism Group Ensemble, so which is a research group that gives voice to early career researchers from the Global South. And particularly, I knew Ohoud more through her one particular article that she published with us last year in Cities Journal, where we were I was lead editing this special issue, Counter Cities, so storytelling counter cities. So I was lead editing this with my other colleagues, Donna Hoston and Michelle Lobo. And that particular paper is really interesting. So that was about mundane activism as a mode of urban repair, a view from the Global South. So actually that explains how Ohoud is embedded in the Global South connections. And she's also a voice from the South. So as a continuation of all these interesting works, today Ohoud is going to unpack on towards epistemic justice, mapping the alternative. So let me turn it over to you, Ohoud. So welcome, and you can talk about 40 minutes, then we'll take some questions. Over to you, Ohoud.
Right, thanks, Ash. Victor was telling me my screen is frozen.
Oh, it's good. It's perfect now.
Okay, wonderful. So let me share my screen. Okay. Right, so this should be it. So good afternoon, everyone. As usual, a talk doesn't work in vacuum of gratitude. So first and foremost, thank you, Ash, for inviting me. Thank you, InfUr, for hosting such fabulous sets of talks that truly create this sort of paradigm shift in how we think. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, Ohoud.
Great. So from my environment, from Amman and my position, it's good morning. So I told Ash, I've always watched InfUr seminars. I watched them this week and the past week more rigorously and more religiously to prepare for this talk. And something clearly emerged from all of these talks that I'm going to be sort of dwelling upon in a minute. But let me just think about this group for a bit. So obviously, this group is about teasing out what informality is, what it might mean, how to think about it, how to deal with it, right? And my addition in teasing out this interpretation is this. So how does geography and positionality play a role in making sense of informality? But before teasing this out further, let me first contemplate on the previous talks, if I may. The clear output or what emerged from listening and looking at all of these seminars is the plurality of this term, or perhaps even verb, as Kim Dovey says. Some scholars, such as Fran Tonkes, in her talk, spoke about the fluidity of informality through exploring its idioms. Kelly Dombrowski's perspective emphasizes the transformative potential of informal care practices that lead to significant collective change. Others, like Clifford Amoako, might say it's a practice or mode of urbanization that might be the solution to many urban challenges. And Hussam Kamalipour agrees with Clifford, if I may interpret it that way, in how cities or how informality is not merely an aberration, but an integral part of how cities are constructed and experienced. In other interpretations, such as that of Michele Lancione, it is emphasized that informality is a structural issue that challenges the usual binary of informal and formal. A shift of focus is then gained when listening to Sabina Andren, where materiality, so we're focusing on something more specific, materiality of informality, specifically the walls and graffiti on the walls, which become of what could be seen as a fragment or a lens through which larger processes can be understood. Finally, Jenny Robinson brings us to a more comprehensive close in that informality is an essential element in understanding urbanization. So building on these interpretations, it becomes evident that there is this plural nature, perhaps, to informality, shaped by this rich array of perspectives, not only within the works of these scholars that I just mentioned, but across the broader discourse on this topic. So each scholar's approach reveals this sort of distinct facet, right, of informality influenced by their positions, as in their backgrounds, their geographical contexts. It becomes as if informality resists this sort of fixed or complete understanding, leaving us with an inherent sense of partiality, perhaps, and ongoing discovery about what it truly represents and the forces shaping it. So perhaps there's a sense of incompleteness of what it's supposed to be, and this gears me towards the foundation of my talk, the mapping of the alternative. Because for me, informality is sort of this alterity, right, towards what it's supposed to be, what's supposed to be standardized, alterity to generalization, alterity to how we frame things, how we perhaps fix things, or the need to fix things, or how we are urged by our practice to standardize. It might be an indication that informality is all of this and perhaps a bit more. It embraces this plurality and opinions around it, which will make its incompleteness a project for completeness. So today I'm going to interrogate two things and then reflect on them. So essentially, I'm first going to problematize the alternative by resorting to worldviews of our geographies. And here I'm building upon what the indigenous geography scholar Neo Kamaigabu rightly says, in that we are not a monolith. And hence geographies, as in its plurality, is essential as a term in contrast to geography. The second part will concentrate on an alternative narrative from my position, from the city of Amman, and how I make sense of what is seen as informal. I then will end with a few reflections on what and how we could relate alternative thinking and mapping to practice and policies. So rooting the alternative worldview is, of course, far off an exhaustive narrative. And within the time frame today, I'm resorting to several contrasting examples. So the start of this talk is going to be much of a teaser. I'll be taking several world maps and other representations of maps to showcase the alterity of views and how that essentially drives to question how we see and understand our world and then relate it later to informality. But before I share the maps, I would like to interrogate something that Thomas Kuhn has said in his book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in relation to the problematic of shared and consistent worldview or understanding. So Thomas Kuhn suggests that one of the major ways in which theoretical paradigms about the world change is through the accumulation of anomalies, that is, observations and pieces of data that do not fit into the existing theories and generalizations, or cannot be accounted for by existing paradigms. The Kuhnian position, however, stresses discoveries in the real world that forces a rethinking of our approaches. This approach, however, assumes that these discoveries come from the real world, which shows he believes in an objective truth, similar to, Plato's idea that there's this deeper, unchanging reality behind what we observe. This might be seen problematic, as Janet Abou-Lughed rightly points out, because anomalous findings can emerge not only from what is being observed, but also from the perspective of the observer, which suggests multiple realities and worldviews. As I said, and I stress, the examples I will share are far from exhaustive, but aim to showcase that interpretation of sociospatial phenomena are largely shaped by our positionalities, the position of our geography, our culture, and other issues such as gender, perhaps, but also our political geography and the complexity of the subject being studied. The first map I love to share with you is a map of the world by Al-Adrisi, the Arab geographer and traveler from the Middle Ages in the 12th century. This map is drawn with the south facing upward. Directing maps with the south at the top was a common practice in Islamic cartography. From this direction, Mecca, the holiest city in the Islamic world and its focal point, is located at the top and most prominent part of the map. This choice, if we look backwards, sort of challenges the modern standards of north to top orientation. We should know that at this time, geography school was sort of a descriptive school that was based on the geographer's travels and personal observation. And at that time, Arabs did not name this map a map. They actually called it a picture, or in Arabic, surah, implicitly showcasing a certain perspective to the world, because maps are supposedly scientific. A picture, on the other hand, depends on the angle, the person who took that picture, and what is to be shown. The word map was actually taken by the Egyptians from the French word carte. They Arabized it then to khart and then kharita, which means map. And my point here, and that I'm interrogating, is what makes a map a map? What should these maps represent? Who decides that? This map, which many of us relate to perhaps, was drawn by Gerardus Mercator, a Flemish cartographer and geographer, best known for creating the Mercator projection in 1569. The problem of this map is that it significantly distorts the size of land masses, those far from the equator. And by the way, this is the map we use in Google Maps. This is our reference. So in relation to distortion, Greenland looks the same size as Africa, whereas Africa is 14 times the size of Greenland. Alaska is the same size as Brazil, or it's portrayed that way, but Brazil is about 5 times larger than Alaska. This depiction of the world is partial and could be seen as confirmation of centrality of European world. And as J.B. Harley says in his seminal article, Constructing the Map, the Renaissance in Europe gave modern cartography, coordination systems, Euclid scale maps, and accurate measurements that all help to confirm a new myth, such as that of the Mercator. Adding to that, Harley says, to those who have strength in the world shall be added strength in the map. And much of the problematic of representation then is normative science, in that it operates behind a seemingly neutral science. And then you have a totally different map that challenges profiling or preconception of what the map should be. Stick charts were originally used by Marshallese people in Marshall Islands to be able to navigate during long ocean voyages. Although the graphs are stylized, They were functional objects that provided information on the location of individual islands as well as wave patterns. This example consists of a mesh structure of 7 vertical sticks tied to 4 horizontal sticks. This corner extends outside the main grid, while 3 curved strips, possibly representing ocean inflation patterns, stretch from side to side. Intersections created by oblique sticks in the corners might indicate the location of certain islands. So essentially what we saw are various maps, right, in which the who and the where, as in geography, obviously play a major role. I mean, who and where are key factors when we talk about what is considered alternative knowledge. This is because the notion of alternative resists this Eurocentric or Anglo-American tendency to flatten and homogenize how our world is seen or represented, including how we see informality. So who sees informality? Who interprets informality? And where does it take place? As Walter Mignolo argues, the concept of alternative is not about pushing back against these dominant frameworks and acknowledging diverse perspective, or what Boaventura de Santos calls moving beyond the one world view. Mignolo particularly mentions the geo and body politics of knowledge that highlight the epistemic, ethical, and political consequences of these positions, challenging traditional power dynamics in knowledge production. Geopolitics of knowledge refers to the ways in which knowledge is influenced by geographical and political contexts. It examines how global power relations shape what is considered valid knowledge, often privileging Western epistemologies while marginalizing local or indigenous forms of knowledge. Body politics of knowledge focuses on the embodied experiences and situated knowledges of individuals and communities. This highlights how personal and collective identities inform the production of knowledge. Many writings have helped sort of cater for other explanation, in contrast to understanding, general understanding of informality. At least for me, these were a part of those. And now, in relation to my position in Jordan, there was still a comprehensive overview missing. I remember when talking to someone in relation to my research and my thesis, they advised me to use Lefebvre to understand all of these diverse informalities. It would have been easy, because there's nothing easier than using a theatrical container and drop-ons work in. But what these writings did, amongst others, is to question whose reality and what epistemological reference should be used to make sense of the phenomena outside the Eurocentric world, such as informality. So after problematizing the alternative, I want to share an alternative understanding of what we see to be informal spaces in Amman, and how I make sense of them through a conceptual framework I developed. Particularly through mundane activism. First, a bit of context. In a global South context, as Anani Roy says, it seems always to be tempting to understand the tactics and struggles of the urban poor as instances of rebellion and mobilization. More so, most research on history and politics focuses, as Pereira says, on the organized, large-scale protests, right-based movements, and oppositional claims that appear to challenge the state and capital. He further explains that despite this significance, this lens misses out on the achievements of the subalterns. Indeed, and as Bayat confirms, there have been certain distinct and unconventional forms of agency that do not equate or do not get adequate attention because they do not fit into our prevailing categories and conceptual imaginations. So what about other forms of activism that do not resort to rebellion or mobilization, nor resort to confront the state or form demands? And how do they relate to informality? It is from this interrogation that I developed the concept of mundane activism, both from the analysis of various cases within my ongoing research and through an exploration of literature tackling ordinary forms of activism within different disciplines. The writings of Omar Razzaz and Muna Fawaz provide particularly valuable insights into the complexities of informality, especially in the context of the global South. and helped shape this conceptual lens of mundane activism. These particularly challenge traditional views that reduce it to mere illegality. So Razaz, for instance, emphasizes how the dynamics in an area called Yajuz illustrate a semi-autonomous social field where local actors, particularly tribes from Bani Hassan, navigate and reshape state authority, claiming back their lands. The roots of this land conflict can be traced back to the British Mandate period, during which much of these tribes' pastoral lands within their tribal domains were registered as state lands. However, a sort of adaptive strategy surfaces between state and these tribes that shape their relation to their lands of what a traditional view might assign as informality. Similarly, Fawaz highlights Hezbollah's role in the post-2006 reconstruction of southern Beirut, demonstrating how non-state actors can assume planning responsibilities typically reserved for the state, thus complicating the narrative of top-down governance. Together, their works reveal that informality is a multifaceted issue that transcends legality and simplistic categorization, urging a deeper understanding of the interactions between state power, community agency, and urban planning practices. And as Fawaz states, we really need to look at how planning actually works rather than how it should work. There seems to be someone who has their mic on. I don't know who it is, but there is sort of this voice in the background. So what is mundane activism? I argue that mundane activism is a form of activism inscribed in everyday actions, situated within political restrictions and an urban context of Jordan that did not undergo the social and economic transformations associated with Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. Various social groups, such as the one in my research, resort to other forms of mobilizations. These everyday actions are neither demands on the system nor an organized movement aiming at structural change. They are a contestation of the status quo without aiming for direct confrontation with the state. Situated within the context of Amman, it seems that these social groups are under political constraints, which push them to resort to this particular form of activism. So let's root this a bit in literature to relate and create a more nuanced understanding. In literature, there are many ways to understand activism, which is essentially due to the various disciplinary boundaries in which they are rooted, as well as what is seen as conventional in certain geographies. Some relate activism to the overt, spectacular forms of resistance, and then you have others that argue of unspectacular and activities that might be considered insignificant because of their limited geographical reach. Yet these still create progressive changes in people's lives. However, generally speaking, when we talk about activism, there is a consensus that it refers to any kind of human activity, individual or collective, that aims to engender change in people's lives and takes shape outside conventional ways to affect social change. So why is that? Because they do not have access to channels that help them in their pursuit. Scholars have explored this idea of everyday activism under various umbrellas, as you can see. Different terms surface, such as everyday resistance, tactics, familiarizing space, non-movement movement, DIY urbanism, and these terms reflect a common understanding of how people in situations of precarity, imbalance, or opportunity resort to ordinary acts of resistance or encroachment. The underlying theme in these writings seem to be recognitions of spaces created and associated actions as resulting from an everyday notion of action. What sets these concepts apart are the intricacies that tailor how the action takes shape based on the social group category, social group resources, aim of the social group, and the regularity framework of the context. So positioning, again, because this is all about authority and the idea of positioning our academic scholarship. So positioning everyday forms of activism within the Middle East context, it is often the case that everyday practices among popular classes have frequently been portrayed as defensive coping mechanisms. But the larger problematic in Jordan, and which has been sort of argued about, is that over the course of history, Jordanians lack meaningful, formal or informal mechanisms for communicating their concerns and demands. Society, the Jordanian society, does not seem to be able to articulate these issues in terms of general demands on the system. And most Middle Eastern countries, including Jordan, have weak civil societies in the Western sense due to political restrictions on their development. So in Jordan, for instance, political parties were outlawed in 1957 and legalized only in 1992. Nowadays, official government rhetoric declares support for civil society, but in reality, they opt for straightforward repression. However, despite Jordan's skeptical view of this civil society, it has since the 1980s accepted the advent of social society under international pressure for political liberation. Yet the irony is that most forms of these civil society that were tolerated have been dominated by large and formalized NGOs of royal and foreign patronage or quasi-governmental NGOs. So civil society organizations have therefore faced many obstacles in establishing themselves as active bodies within society, and they are heavily controlled by the state. So situated within the context of Amman, it seems that these social groups face constraints which push them to resort to this sort of particular form of mundane activism. So now that I have established what mundane activism is and traced it in sort of this historical genealogy across writing, a valid question would be, how is it rooted? And how does it take shape? I argue that it takes shape through what I call material and non-material acts of repair. I essentially build on Gautam Band's understanding of repair, which is seen as an act everyone can, should, and generally does. So if you come to think about repair, repair is sort of indicating that something is not working as it should. The act of repair shows agency, perhaps, right? And local knowledge. Without this local knowledge, the things that need repairing will not be able to do so. So how has this concept been dealt with before? And how has this conceptualization been dealt before? I'm going to talk a bit about this. So in the beginning, this concept of repair was not necessarily rooted in the urban and could possibly be traced back to the writings of Nigel Thrift and Stephen Graham. Their work actually opened up the possibility of understanding repair as a process through which certain objects or situations gain significance, as things or situations only become visible when they become inoperable. Repair, therefore, has been approached in various ways, including Southern modes of urbanism, care practice, urban communing practices. You have repair, as Southern city making struggles, amongst others. So repair can be simply mitigating, but could equally be radical. It could take a more confrontational dimension with a clear aim to counteract, but also as a mundane form based on certain relations and social capital. Repair as a concept has had a long implicit history in vast writings, particularly to notions of how certain situations, buildings, infrastructure, and spaces have been reconfigured, maintained, repurposed, and mended by certain social groups that found other means to their ends. So building on Gautam Band's writing again, what is crucially important about urban repair, and as I mentioned previously, is that everybody can, should, or generally does repair in some form, right? So there is no particular professionals whose sector, domain, or practice is repair, making it an easily applicable of urbanism to restore a certain functionality, especially for actors who live in challenging settings where access to services and equality is restrictive. But the concept of urban repair gains significant value because it is closely embedded in empirical realities and praxis. The exploration of these realities through repair can reveal the necessary differences of urban territories, providing opportunities for relational understandings of various geographies. Additionally, the concept of urban repair allows for the reimagining of the pedagogy of formal and technical practice in architecture, as Band suggests. So this means that moments and processes of repair can become pedagogical settings themselves, learning grounds, as Ortiz and Milan note. By conceptualizing repair in this way, we can develop a deeper understanding of the complex relations between urban environments, social structures, and technical practices. Urban repair, of course, has limitations, and it can be restrictive and may not address underlying systematic issues or confront power structures as they repair a fragment, right? They don't repair the source of the problem. Additional repair can produce existing inequalities as it does not really address structural changes. However, understanding how communities use repair tools can reveal policy constraints and really give a sense of agency of communities. So by looking at actions of local actors that are usually named informal actors, by looking at their actions through material and non-material actions of repair, as I suggest, we can see and interpret what is not working and how local actors find ways to repair it in a material manner, which means through spatial interventions, and non-material matter, by which I mean through social systems and relations. This allows to interrogate informality from a plural and alternative understanding, but also uncovering particularities of how repair is done. So in a sense, why repair? Why in that particular manner and under what conditions? In the coming slides, I will operate these lenses and position them in relation to mapping alterity. So this, for instance, is an alternative mapping, particular of one of the tangible actions of repair that I mapped of the Friday market in Amman. It contrasts the original plan of the municipality with the current repaired plan of the local actors or vendors in this case. So the original plan of the municipality is on the upper row and the repaired plan is on the lower. So after being relocated from its prime location to make way for high-end development, the market's new site housed fewer stalls, less than half of the original 1,400. In response, vendors repaired the layout by adding extra stalls and creating corridors for improved access, bypassing the municipality's plan. This illustrates perhaps a tangible act of local agency in shaping their urban spaces. Then so I can further tease out particularities, a land map use was created, revealing what is often hidden, insurgent uses that defy formal regulations. It highlighted informal stalls, extended the visitor's stay and enhanced their experience, also provided essential livelihoods. This mapping of illicit practices challenges conventional urban planning by foregrounding local agency and resistance, offering this sort of critical perspective, right, on how marginalized actors actively reshape their spaces to meet their needs despite restrictive policies. As Rebecca Solnit aptly notes, maps are not just tools for navigation, but also reflections of the endless possibilities and interpretations of the world. When we map alternatives, multiple versions of space emerge, revealing layers of meaning that often go unnoticed in official representations. This idea becomes particularly relevant when considered hidden dynamics within this market, like the case of migrant employment in the market, a phenomenon that remains officially unmapped, yet deeply embedded in its everyday operations. In this market, many of the workers are Egyptian migrants, employed to sell alongside local vendors. This practice, while commonplace, violates the regulations set by the municipality, which stipulate that only stall owners may operate their own stalls. Yet the official map of the market, which presents neatly numbered stalls, fails to capture these informal arrangements. When we look at the alternative mapping of the market below, however, a different story unfolds. Many stalls have merged, boundaries are blurred, and the spaces have been re-identified through informal practices and relationships, offering a more accurate representation of how the market actually functions. Vendors also took matters in their own hands by installing a low-light system, addressing the failure of municipal floodlights, which were too high and blocked by overhead covers, as we can see on the right picture. One vendor charged 1 JD per map, which is £1, and nearly all 600 plus stalls adopted the system as a necessity for displaying goods. So despite this being illegal, this lighting solution became vital for a business. It illustrates how local actors create these informal infrastructures to compensate for inadequate municipal services, challenging again the boundaries of formal urban planning and reflecting the power of everyday practices in reshaping their spaces. Conventional mapping often presents material spaces in neutral, scientific terms, oversimplifying their inherent complexities and lived experiences. Mapping the informal structures created by vendors revealed the nuanced dynamics and lived experiences that conventional maps again overlook. The original market stalls designed by the municipality of Amman, they referred to them as carriages, were steel frame structures with an overhead cover of flat green porous fabric. These stalls, occupying a space of approximately 3.75 square meters, provided minimal display area, as the table covered about a quarter of the designated space, offering vendors only about 2 square meters to showcase their goods. Vendors found these designs inadequate for their diverse product, prompting them to pressure GAM for change. In response, they introduced their own personalized stall structures. This adaptive response included using wooden trays, steel bars, and plastic hangers tailored to their merchandise, demonstrating a high level of customization. The vendors also created overhead covers from durable, low-cost materials that could withstand rain and wind, contrasting sharply with GAM's designs. The term carriages, if I may interpret it, implies sort of this transient, impermanent nature, suggesting that GAM's designs do not seem to recognize or grant the vendors' needs for stability and permanence in their livelihoods. So the juxtaposition of these images of municipalities' proposed stall, the first row, and the vendors' existing stalls illustrates the clash between formal urban planning and the realities of everyday life in the market. The municipalities' proposed stalls, characterized by their rigid steel frame and minimal surface area, embody a top-down approach that prioritizes uniformity and regulation over the actual needs of vendors. The setup of the overhead covers of stalls displays social communication and, most importantly, comradeship, in which vendors would collaborate and share ropes. Their social embeddedness is not only expressed through their social cooperation, but also in a coordinated chanting ritual. A vendor would chant a sentence while others would repeat after him. The chanting lines are catchy and funny. They rhyme and sometimes incorporate English words as well. So vendors would also chant. Some vendors would chant on their own. Some of the chants would include phrases such as, "These are European clothes that would make an old woman look young." Another would say, "Buy and throw away." In a sense, they are so cheap you can afford to buy so many and then throw away what is worn out. Others were shouting the prices of the pieces and their types, such as wool goods for 2 JDs, cottons for 1 JD, and again, 1 JD is £1. So the chanting seems to come at times when the shopping was slow. Thus, they would make special offers, hoping it would pick up. Other times, it seemed to be a strategy to energize themselves and the others. With over 600 stalls, it seemed also to be a marketing strategy. One vendor reported it is also part of entertaining the visitors. So these non-material actions of repair show how these local actors are able to come together to incrementally restore, alter, and maintain an urban space over a period of time. Through an infrastructure of social capital, as Ash and Donna Houston wonderfully illustrate in their work of rethinking care as alternative infrastructure. As they further explain, such a relational and interdependent nature of infrastructures as social capital helps recognize democratic forms of public care and repair in unequal worlds, where marginalized actors get the chance to actually participate in reparation. So repair shows vendors' agency in shaping the urban environment. So rather than waiting for external interventions or relying solely on GAM, the formal institutions, vendors take action to repair and manage their workspaces in a way that meets their needs and aligns with their values and priorities. In the case of Friday Market, repair took the shape of replacing, creation, transgression, and informal management systems. These practices, or these repair practices, which take a mundane form of activism, should not be seen as an exceptional form of urbanization. They appear worldwide and seem to represent valid responses to the limitations of planning. They also document community agencies and their creative ways and skills that operate outside certain formal channels. Simone, for instance, discusses how residents of Hillbrow, a densely populated area of Johannesburg, have created their own informal networks of care and support that provide essential services. In Kalyanpur, a slum in Bangladesh, Value Zaman and Alam described how they self-organized a waste collection system by its community. Nonetheless, these actions do differ across space and time, as this agency is culturally conditioned and historically constructed. In more liberal democratic settings, for instance, they are driven by more diverse intentions and tolerated in a different manner, but equally produce spaces that are of everyday nature and form some kind of activism. And from my position here in Amman, from the Global South, I ask, what does viewing such actions from the Global South mean? This position, what does it mean? Speaking from the South is an opportunity to speak for and of an ex-centric location, as Ban, Kamarov, and Kamarov rightly point out. This refers to perspectives that are outside the usual or expected viewpoint. Location here is a relational geography, of course, that speaks about processes that are typically outside the center or norm. So position and alterity work hand in hand in reshaping how we view informality. But relating more generally to the whole world of worlds, every city will have their own distinctive repair ecologies. And here, as Mohan explained, a comparison across cities becomes a project by itself that needs to be carried out through careful, paradoxical combination of generalizability and specificity, in which the urban can be thought of as composed of a multiplicity of differentiated, repeated outcomes, as Jenny Robinson says. So mundane activism in this regard is one of the many emerging concepts that might help broaden our understanding of urbanization. Such a concept, amongst others, helps move away from a single homogeneous perspective and instead embraces the heterogeneity of urban experiences. As De Sousa Santos rightly argues, we need to embrace this multiplicity to establish epistemic justice and move away from the Western conception of the one world to the idea that there are multiple worlds in our world. By embracing this diversity of urban experiences, we can create a more nuanced understanding of urbanization, particularly mundane activism, as one of many concepts that gears to mapping the alternative as it tries to make sense of these often ignored local logics hidden in more top-down approaches to understanding how our cities are actually shaped. Socially, these hidden logics could be seen and act as soft infrastructure, right? So working with the city at a local level to provide neighborhoods with much needed services. And spatially, it has the potential to produce operational knowledge of spaces. And now my final slide. So what does this mean for practice and policies? Perhaps there are many ways forward, but a useful starting point is to rethink how our existing systems are working and consider the possibility of three types of change in our planning: a structural, a relational, and a transformative or transformational change. A change that could open up to what I call indigenous ways of thinking planning practices. Indigenous here is synonymous with local knowledge found in everyday practices. And here I suggest, by building on the model of Kanye et al., that change is possible to happen by first and foremost scrutinize the position we are writing from. And here I relate to the beginning of my talk, but also the subject we are writing on and from which geography we are positioned. This would potentially help create change in the mental modes of how we think about informality, but also rethinking the power dynamics and relations by interrogating and testing various governance possibilities, such as multi-governance arrangements. And finally, for policy and practices, This could mean moving away from the rigid top-down towards a more adaptive framework. Frameworks that adapt to this incompleteness, perhaps, as borrowing this from Prince Guma, this incompleteness that is part and parcel of our world of worlds. Thank you.
I truly appreciate Ohoud for such a provocative talk and also so theoretically well informed. And also thanks for summarizing all those past few seminars so nicely. So we really appreciate that. I think, yeah, so we are recording this, so it's going to be an interesting document for our larger audience. Where to start? I mean, I definitely like the way you started to problematize and also question who holds the agency in map making. And later, when you started to talk about, and obviously you talked about heterogeneity, but I think there is a subtle notion of also pushing that boundary of heterogeneity to think about beyond heterogeneity. So what are the anomalies and what are the values of those anomalies and how to think about or think through those anomalies in thinking about plural form of informality kind of. So this is really thought-provoking, and as you know, we have quite a few members in InfUr who are actually very much invested in map making. So without further ado, I'm going to open the floor to our audience here who are in person to ask some questions, and then obviously we can take a few questions from online.
Sure. Thanks, Ash.
Anybody from the room? Yes, please.
Can I just speak for you?
Yeah, sure.
Try this. Thank you for that presentation. I really appreciate it. I wrote all my questions down as I went along. I think in most of the texts that you sort of mentioned on the alternative, actions of the kind of these subaltern populations, is that there is a kind of practice, or at least kind of almost like a spirit that's not only prevents the worst, but kind of promising them something better, right? So in a way, it's kind of distinct from survival or the everyday resistance, in that most of these struggles are not really carried out by or at the cost of their fellow people, but often of the state. So what seems crucial to me is having a kind of an awareness of not confusing a recognition of oppression with sort of acts of resistance against it. And my question, I guess, in that regard is, like, how does your notion of repair respond to this context? And what is at stake here for the state, right? And I ask this because in architecture, right, we would usually associate repair as a sort of an action to go back to its original condition, not so much to gain from it, right? We would probably use a term renovation or an improvement, which sort of, for me, sits much more closer to resilience. I'm not sure if that's a very clear question, but
Thank you. I didn't catch your name.
Alex, sorry, I don't think I forgot myself.
No worries. No worries. Thanks, Alex, for this question. It's a very valid one because it questions sort of the let's say conditions of repair, right, and the limitations of this term. And I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of what does this sort of help us understand on an ontological sense, right? So my provocation here is that I see repair as a tool to uncover these alternative understanding. It's not exhaustive, but for me, in my research, I was really able to sort of pinpoint what's not working, what's not being managed, what's being sidelined, what's being oppressed, by seeing how people were repairing, which is also incomplete, because at the end of the day, we're talking about people that have always been marginalized. So in the case of the Friday market, they repaired with what they have, with what they could, do. So it's far again from the incomplete answer. So for instance, these sort of covers that they brought in contrast to the municipality covers, which are porous, these covers in summer make the market very hot. So again, as I say, there are limitations to repair, and perhaps one can tease it out further in terms of understanding how repair can become a structural element of change, and not only sort of this element of temporary fix. And this is part of the limitations I spoke about, in that repair is a very temporal, and it doesn't create structural change, and that's why these informal sellers and many people in that situation use it in that way, because it's easy. You can repair something in the way you can, in the tools that you have, in a quick time, to gain quick results. And hence, this is sort of how I understand it. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Ohoud. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks so much, Ohoud, for a very interesting talk. My name's Sebastian. Can you hear me all right through this microphone? Okay, good. I'm coming from anthropology, so your discussion of worlds within worlds, ontological difference, as well as positionality really quite resonated. I'll ask a few questions if I can, and maybe you can give quite brief answers, and then, so we've got enough time. But I'm interested in the sellers themselves. What were their analyses of the work that they were doing? Did they see their actions in the terms that you're talking about, or did they have different ways of understanding kind of care or repair or activism? I'm also interested in knowing a bit about the government's expectations. Did they kind of put forward this, a model of what a market would look like with enough space for the sellers to then change things as they go? Or did they really expect that those porous, tiny little green squares would be enough for the sellers? Like, was that they're thinking? And then a kind of conceptual one, which you've already spoken about in response to Alex's question, which is, I'm really interested in your use of the word repair when the thing is new, like the plan is new, it hasn't broken down from something that was before. So I guess my question is, what does thinking with repair tell us about the kinds of practices that you're talking about, when something's not broken, but it's actually made wrong from the beginning, if that makes sense?
Yes. Thanks, Sebastian. Very interesting questions. So in terms of sellers, yes, definitely. In terms of the thematic coding that was done, these words were sort of always emerging. This idea of caring for each other, this idea of social relations, this idea of coming together to fix together this sense. So other ways, for instance, just to clarify, was that the municipality gave each seller a number, and per number they would go into the market and start setting up. Of course, this clashes with these 600 stalls, because some of them are in the back, and some of them are in the front, and some of them are on the right, some of them are on the left, and hence there was no kind of order. Like, for instance, if somebody, if the first one came in and his tent and stall was at the front, he would be in the way of the stall owner that has his tent or stall in the back. So stall owners started coming together, and this is sort of this intangible form of repair, and started organizing themselves, saying, okay, you are in the back right, you go in first, then I go in first, and sort of these sort of management arrangements that compensate for states, for the municipalities' failure. So that is in terms of the sellers. And this is sort of, it goes in line with perhaps the Jordanian society, if I might talk about the positionality of the geography of this case, in that people always find their own solutions. They have sort of this mistrust in the state. They don't think that they can find a solution from the state. So there are sort of this always organizations of the individual and the group level to find answers. In terms of the state, you were asking about the stalls, right? And how this sort of ideology of the stall was created and was placed. The thing is that GAM, the municipality's employees, are very much entrenched in engineering discipline, and what they see as functioning is something that is purely structural, something, you know, where it's a table where they place their products or merchandise on. You have this sort of thing, this porous flat roof above you, and that's it. They don't really interrogate, or they don't feel the need to interrogate the social aspect. And this can be seen in one of my first interviews with the director of the market. And what happened actually was that I was given the map of the market, the previous market where it was. And I started asking him about the social community that operates this market. And he became very defensive. It's saying, like, you are an urban planner. I tell you the measurements of this market, but you don't come to me to understand the social dynamics. And sort of this understanding, again, the worldview of what should be a stall is very much rooted in this dislocated social understanding, where they don't feel the need to understand the dynamics to produce something. And the third thing, which is you interrogated this idea of new plan, right? And repair, am I correct?
Yes, definitely. And how, like, what repair does when the thing is made wrong from the beginning, rather than made right, broken down, and then repaired back to where it was.
Yes. Again, this is really rooted in the specificity of the political condition of Jordan. People really don't have the agency or the political ability to change things on the ground, and hence, even if if they wanted to repair the previous market, the municipality just straightforward oppressed them and relocated it and built it from the start. So so this idea of repair, again, I think can be interrogated in different manners in different geographies. So perhaps in Jordan, within this political restriction and within how the society evolved and what tools they have to create change and how agency unfolds, sort of frames repair in this way. But perhaps locating it in different geographies will make it take different definitions. And I think that's okay. I think we should have this sort of multiplicity that at the end of the day, we make sense of on a larger scale.
Excellent. I mean, we're running out of time, so we'll just take one more question from David.
Thanks.
And then we will close. Yeah.
I'll be very quick. I'm very interested in whether the traders were adapting to the actions of the state or whether they were actually contesting them. And that would be shown up in two questions, I guess. One is at the overall scale, when you showed in your big plan certain elements of repair. Did they actually extend stalls out into the street? Did they move stall lines or otherwise contest what the state had done? And then at the detail level, I'm assuming the state actually built these rather bizarre little structures. Did they just demolish them and take the materials? Are they still extant in the middle of these? In other words, are they actually changing what the state did, or are they just adapting around what the state did?
Right. Thank you, David. Well, no, the structures were taken out totally. The vendors went crazy and they said, like, these structures, we can't make use of them. And they brought in their total, all of their structures. And it's a very interesting question, the idea of how much of this boundary was transgressed, right? So what happened is that they built a wall around the market to sort of already forecast the idea of the market flowing out. But there was one part of the market on the northern side where they didn't anticipate that the sellers would repair, which is quite a slopey area, but the sellers were able to sort of transgress and appropriate that place and place their stalls there. And just to clarify something as well, which sort of managed these ways of repair, is that the state came in when they started sort of contesting and bringing in their own stalls and appropriating. The state came in with total force, with gendarmerie forces, and there were clashes, and hence there was this sort of structural element towards establishing what the state wants to be as a market. And that's where repair became sort of, I think, adapting and contesting in a theoretical sense, but not in a practical sense. It was more of adapting, trying to find and carve out ways of sort of managing their spaces and sort of producing the best of the space for their livelihood.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Ohoud. It's already 5:04, but if you allow, we could perhaps take one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Or maybe two questions. Two questions.
Sure.
Thank you. I'm Shazeb. I really like the presentation. So you've talked about repair as contestation through this lens of where improvisation becomes a work of negation. That's where it brings contestation. But I'm wondering if when is it possible that where repair is not negation, but instead complements the existing inequalities? And if it does, what do we call it then?
Yes. This is quite an intricate question, I must say. I do agree that to a certain extent, this is sort of a parallel as of action, right? So repair is sort of working in parallel to what the state is doing. So the intersections are not present, right? The state suppresses and creates a certain urban space through the municipality. And again, the sellers or vendors or the local actors, they adapt. And it might be seen as complementing because this adaptation constantly allows, perhaps, and I'm just interpreting while thinking about your question, it might be sort of allowing for the continuity of the structural suppression and not really gearing for a clear change on a higher end of policy, right? But again, through other cases that I studied, for instance, there is a highway in Amman, and part of that highway had the tribal lands of some of the Jordanian tribal lands, and of course these lands became state land, but the Jordanians still felt that these are their lands. And after the structural change in Jordan, many of these tribes didn't have any more state jobs. They were always incorporated in the state jobs because the tribes were part and parcel of establishing Jordan. So what they did was, again, finding ways and carving out ways to establish their own spaces. And that's when they created this sort of public space near the highway. Yes, it's near the highway, and it's overlooking all of their lands. And this is sort of their way to say, like, these are our lands. We're going to create a livelihood out of it. You have, you know, not incorporated us in state jobs as you used to, due to these structural foreign changes. And despite us, you know, helping in establishing this state of Jordan, now you are turning your backs, to us. So again, whilst the tribes demand these lands, there is no structural change again. And I think this goes in line with what I said earlier, that the society of Jordan didn't develop through, industrial revolution and the capitalistic evolution as other, European and, global North cities and states. So they didn't develop this ability to.
I mean, for the sake of time, sorry. Maybe we can go to a last question from.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, King.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ohoud, for a really stimulating presentation. One of the best we've heard in a long time, I think.
Thank you.
Look, I think good presentations often end on difficult questions, so I'm not really going to expect you to answer this too much. But your title has the phrase epistemic justice, right? And you didn't, that's the one part I suppose you didn't really talk about. So I don't really want to open that up, but to raise it, perhaps there's another problematic here, because in some ways that raises the idea of, justice to me raises the idea of some kind of condition that's kind of missing, that it's again, we're talking about something we see not happening in our cities, right? And the idea of repair, as we heard before, is about this, perhaps a return to something that in many cases which never existed. I don't have a clear question here, but the idea of justice seems to me to have some of the same problems of the language, because if the idea of epistemic justice means anything, it's embedded in language. And it seems to me we've done a lot of trying to rethink the language that we're using, and indeed inventing new terms to apply to the conditions that we're seeing. And I see a fair bit of churn in that. I'm not sure how you feel about that we keep inventing new words. And there's quite a lot of people who think that the language of informality is really tired, and we need to go now beyond informality. So we get this kind of beyondism, which is popular. Where do you fit in all that? Maybe in one sentence. Do you think we need to go, do we need to go beyond informality? You can answer yes or no.
I do think, yes, we need, because some of these particularities of our cities at many times do not fit some of these terms. And despite, we have so many, an agglomeration, as you said, and dictionary, perhaps we need to create this sort of dictionary of informality and see how it relates to positionality, to geography, to our backgrounds, and then map it out. See what map we can create and what does that tell us. So that's a new knowledge then as well.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent, Ohoud. Certainly, I think your particular that quote, beyond the usual, I think that's going to stay with me for a while. And sounds like there is an interesting paper looming, and we're soon going to read it or review it, whatever form it takes. So thanks for joining us, and we really appreciate your time in such early morning, and especially as you are just starting your semester over there. So go well with that. And can we have a big